my gratitude first and foremost to the Right Livelihood team for organizing this community of practice, which I consider to be an opportunity to not just share my work with you all, but to also pick your brain a bit more on some of the issues that we're working on. And as you may have seen from the agenda already, the two discussions before were focused on creating a common understanding of what gender equality is, and also the challenges that still exist. And so I want to build on that as well too, by discussing with you today what we have learned in Somalia, which is obviously still an ongoing journey, and how we are applying some of those new strategies in my work. And to understand from this community as well too, of what your thoughts are on how this could be applicable in other contexts. So the challenges for gender equality are many, and the implications of inequality for women and girls in Somalia are dangerous and life-threatening. And for many, gender equality is almost synonymous to sexual violence because of how intrinsically and closely the two are connected, and how they're affecting women and girls of all ages. In fact, Somalia has been ranked as one of the worst countries in the world for sexual violence. The United Nations estimates that 1 in 5 women in Somalia has experienced sexual violence, and many cases are going underreported due to fear of retaliation or stigma. And because of the decades of violence and instability, which has led down to the breakdown of the social and legal institutions, there's very little protection measures in place. And on that backdrop of the life-threatening scenario for women and girls as a result of gender equality, you may be wondering why I decided to focus today on sports and mental health and how this is interconnected with gender equality. And I'll tell you very quickly already that because I believe this to be a workshop and a mutual learning opportunity where we can share with you where we are in our journey, the plight for women and girls' liberation and protection continues, but we believe that if we want to move the needle forward, we also have to be a bit more innovative and daring and work with the opportunities that we have. So we're constantly learning from our community and trying to apply strategies that don't only support the individual recovery in an increasingly challenging environment, but also to understand how this may be applicable, replicable, and scalable to other contexts. But to understand where we are going in Somalia, you have to first understand where we came from. So I'll start by grounding you in the context of my country, in our organization's overlapping and interconnected work, and to share with you how we are now exploring mental health and sports as a means and a medium for the political participation and liberation of women and girls beyond the individual. So just for some demographics, Somalia has a population that's estimated at around 15 million people. More than 78% of the population is under the age of 30. The average age is 15. 30% average primary school enrollment rate. However, we have 100% privatized education system, so there isn't a single public school. The health indicators in Somalia are among the lowest in the world. Only 1 in 3 Somalis have access to safe water. Health is also privatized. 1 in every 9 Somali children dies before their first birthday. This is number 2 worldwide. The maternal mortality rate is the 6th in the world. It's estimated 732 deaths per 100,000 live births. 67% unemployment rate in Somalia. So these numbers are quite daunting. A World Health Organization recorded that 1/3 of the population is afflicted by some sort of mental health disorder. Now, if you look at those statistics, if you consider that the country's been in conflict for 3 decades, that the government is still incredibly fragile, and social services are limited, and when they do exist, they are privatized. This calls for many organizations and individuals to do what they can to offset the challenges that come with this kind of incredibly challenging environment. So with that, I'll give you a little bit of a background about the Elman Peace Center, which you already heard a little bit about. The Elman Peace Center was started by my parents, Fartoon Aden and Elman Ali Ahmed, before the war. And before the war, they were entrepreneurs who had businesses across the country and focused their resources and the revenue they generated to create opportunities for the community that was facing challenges already, whether it was young people that had substance abuse problems or orphans or the elderly that without care, those that are traditionally marginalized and discriminated against because of their ethnicity and their tribe. And when the war broke out, they turned their focus to children and young people that were being co-opted by the warlords, using an approach that addressed the grievances and the vulnerability of people that were being recruited by the warlords. So they were offering jobs, and in exchange for weapons, were giving an alternative dignified livelihood. And they were so successful at this and thwarting the capacity of these warlords in arguably the most challenging time in Somalia, that my parents had to make the decision to split up. My father would continue to fight for peace in Somalia as he saw the impact that this campaign, Drop the Gun, Pick Up the Pen, was creating across the country for men and women alike. And my mother would leave Somalia with my sisters and I. As the conflict continued, we were in Kenya in a refugee settlement, hoping for the situation to get better so that we could go back to Somalia. My parents did not know that would be the last time they would see each other, and my father was killed in Somalia. So that meant for us, it was not possible to return. So my mother, still very young at that time herself, in her early 20s, with 3 young daughters in tow, got the opportunity some years later to get asylum in Canada, where we grew up and where she raised us. She was a fierce custodian of my father's legacy and always had the dream of continuing to return to Somalia. I raise this as well, not just to give you a history of what motivates me and my mother, who's a visionary leader of this organization, but also to understand that Somalia, because of the war, has one of the most displaced communities all around the world. And many of them, first generation, or even those that are born across the world right now that have been resettled, have been watching Somalia either through the news and waiting for the situation to get better, or waiting for the opportunity to be involved in the peaceful transition out of conflict. But as you grow and evolve in a different community, you also adopt new identities, new cultures, new exposures that people come back with and try to contribute to Somalia. Some with success and some with challenges, which we also will discuss more in this workshop as we continue. So my mother returned to Somalia in 2006 during the height of the Ethiopian invasion in Somalia. And she was continuing the work that she had incepted with my father, because the situation did not only improve, it got worse. And whereas now the conflict was not families, it was not warlords, it was not tribes, you had external forces, you had the growing fundamental terrorist group as well too, that had very different strategies for recruiting and exploiting communities. And even in this context, the same recipe that my father and my mother accepted many years before still applied. While we wait for the opportunity to influence political peace, traditional peace agreement processes, that the opportunity and the impetus for investing in social peace also existed. By creating strategies and opportunities to support people to leave armed groups by addressing the grievances they have within the community, the identity challenges, the protection issues, and the economic and livelihood opportunities they needed. So by the time I returned to Somalia in 2010 to see what role I could have in the transition out of conflict as well, for me to support my mother in her purpose, the conflict had changed once again. Whereas now the occupying force and external actors weren't the biggest challenge, but it was the widespread extremist ideology of Al-Shabaab. I returned to Somalia for one reason, which was really to understand my country a bit more, to understand the work that my mother was doing, to appease my own heart as well too, as to why she was there when my sisters and I needed her in Canada. But I stayed for a different reason, which was recognizing that before my mother was even able to address peace, inequality, human, the challenge was a lot closer. The resistance that she faced were of a gender nature, and they were not even societal, they were from my own family. When my mother returned to Somalia and she founded and really launched the Elman Peace Center in honor of my late father, she did so having been widowed, not having any sons. And I did not expect to be confronted with that reality that my own uncles from my father's side would be physically harassing her, shooting up the facility, threatening the existence of the organizations because she dared to honor my father's legacy as a woman. And for her to be the strongest woman I've known in my whole life, to see her being challenged that much was one of the motivators for me to fight alongside her. But it also gave me the recognition that she had the opportunity to leave at any moment. She had the privilege of being able to go back to Canada, but she decided to continue to fight. And I saw the majority of the population she was also supporting were children, they were youth, they were women. And it made me think as well too, what then is the reality for a woman who's widowed in Somalia that doesn't have an opportunity to just leave or escape her circumstances? What then does that mean for the young girl who's brought up in an environment like that? So the motivation to stay changed. And very quickly, I was confronted by how pervasive gender inequality and how dangerous life is for women and girls in Somalia. So our work at the core of it is a peace building organization, but we recognize that peace does not happen in a vacuum. It is more than just the absence of war. It is more than the work that we are doing on disarmament, rehabilitation, reintegration, and giving an opportunity for combatants to no longer be spoilers of peace, but becoming agents of peace for it. We are also a human rights organization, and we had been monitoring and documenting and reporting the violations and abuses that happen. And in 2010, right when just months after I returned to Somalia, which coincided with one of the worst humanitarian crises and droughts the country was afflicted by, we saw hundreds and thousands of people, mostly women with children in tow, coming from all over the country to Mogadishu in desperate search of aid, of food, and humanitarian support. And as part of our human rights work, we had been monitoring the situation, tracking the population movement, and also been recording staggering level of reports around sexual violence that was happening in the internally displaced people's camps. It was a very common sight at that time to see convoys of military trucks and soldiers outside of these camps. And they weren't there to protect the women and girls. They were there to monitor what food or aid they received and to loot that, to steal it, and at night, indiscriminately and quite openly rape and pillage those communities. And so we were reporting on this consistently, and then we're confronted by the reality that there wasn't a single place where we could refer these women and girls for support or services. The hospitals did not have treatment on the post-exposure prophylaxis treatments or the clinical management of rapes. There were many organizations that were also keeping an eye on the situation and reporting on it, but there wasn't a single place of reprieve. And there comes a point of a moral obligation to not just have a survivor sit in front of you and write down the terrible things that have happened to her, but then to offer some sort of support. And that gave birth to Sister Somalia, which is recognized as the first rape crisis center in Somalia. And to say that in 2010, in a country that has been receiving support and international aid for more than 30 years, that in itself came with a lot of challenges. But if there wasn't a single place that we could refer someone to for support, it did give birth to the first facility. And it started off quite humble, very small. It was one room office that doubled into a safe house. And we were able to import the PEP kits and provide support and reach out to our networks across the world and begin to generate a conversation on sexual violence that didn't really before exist, but began to offer support to women in our community. And what we saw happening very quickly after that is a foot traffic of more than almost 40 people a day in this one bedroom, one room office. And so we took some risks to platform the conversation, whether it's on international media, outreach that we did in our community, women that were supported in that one facility on 2 to 3 occasions, the same woman, because the community was not anymore enabling or progressive or safe for her, were then starting to build a bond and relationship with us, that they began to speak about their truth. Somali journalists then started to cover sexual violence for the first time, really openly. And then we saw the survivors and the journalists being arrested. Instead of the perpetrators, it was the journalists and the survivors that were being arrested. And that was, I think, a watershed moment as well, too, in Somalia, where it could have led to a complete silencing of this growing movement, or it could have been the real spark. And I'm glad to be able to look back now. I'm glad to be able to look back on that time now and see that despite the challenges and the road that still is very difficult, that was the spark that we needed. Very soon after that, we had the opportunity to bring the conversation around sexual exploitation and abuse by peacekeeping troops to an international community, whether it's at the UN Security Council or even at the regional level. And again, this was an important moment in uncovering a very thin cloak on an otherwise open secret in society that is said to be completely opposite to our cultures, traditions, and religion. And so that came with reprisals as well. That came to harassment of our staff, shutting down of our facilities. It came to the president at the time, even holding a press conference to say that any organization or institution speaking about rape in Somalia is defaming our culture, our religion, and our country at large. So we realized quickly that women's bodies, women's agencies, women's protection, women's equality, the priority was not the individual. It was about the effect of this heinous act on society at large. And it makes sense now when I think about why that was the position, because our penal code, which has not been reviewed since 1969, does not even consider rape as a crime, but a crime against morality and honor. So if that is a legal definition, it makes sense as to why the protection of women is secondary. On the backdrop of this, we continued our advocacy. We were joined by many other organizations and women within the community, survivors alike, to continue to apply effort and pressure, and women no longer wanted to be silenced. And 2 years after that, we saw a transition into the government. It gave birth to the first transitional federal government in Somalia since the conflict. And with the international community support to build the building blocks of democracy, which we have yet to achieve in Somalia, there was a lot of donor support to the government that was growing at that time. And we took that opportunity also to rally voices of women to participate in the public sphere, which we recognize as necessary for ensuring that the processes that ensure the well-being of women and girls are protected when you have women leaders in those positions. So in a short period of time, between 2010 to 2012, all of this happened, and we saw 11% of women in political participation, to a spike of almost 24%. Now, are they women that were speaking about sexual violence? Were they women that were actively speaking about gender equality, or were they at that time still tokens? The reality is that they were not representing equality at that time, but it was an entry point for accountability, for representation. And so the Elman Peace Center is an organization that is constantly growing to respond to our community's needs and to society as it changes so rapidly, to not only provide services, but to create advocacy and to ensure that we are participating in institutional reform. And that work is an ongoing journey. But as we continue to think about how we can best support women and girls in our community, we realized that the one facility in Mogadishu was not enough, that women and girls were facing a lot of challenges across the country. And over the years, that one rape crisis center grew to support women and girls in the most acute regions across the country, recognizing that women were traveling very long distances, often by foot, just to get access in the capital. So our approach is also decentralizing education, decentralizing awareness, and service delivery throughout the country. But in order to create an environment for gender equality and not just protection, the Rape Crisis Center grew to prevent and respond to gender-based violence across all forms. And that meant domestic violence, that meant access to, denial of access to resources. Somalia, almost 90% of women today and girls are affected by female genital mutilation. So the types of issues that we're looking at are not just individual, but also societal and traditional and cultural. And the women's development centers that we have grown across the countries now are focused on the individual empowerment of women through services and opportunities that give them agency to be able to break the cycle, not for themselves, but also for their children and for their communities at large. Some of the work that we've done in that space include creating access to education. Like I mentioned, education is 100% privatized in Somalia. So for those that can access it, it comes at a high cost. And for those that can't, there are organizations and NGOs that offer education, but only just for a small period of time on funding, which in itself comes with challenges, particularly for girls. A young girl that's never had access to education being introduced to an NGO's opportunity for 6 months, and then funding ends, has its own perils that come with it that we've seen. We create economic opportunities for women and girls to escape the cycles of violence that they're in, to be able to make decisions for themselves and for their families, and to control their own finances as well too, whether it's access to entrepreneurial training, seed funding, creating opportunities for women to come together and have cooperatives. And all of these elements for a long time have been about the individual safety, but have not grown yet to create the impact that they need at a national scale and institutional impact, which is where our journey is still ongoing. As a peace-building organization, we recognize that peace, again, cannot happen just by silencing the weapons. It also has to happen within. The same for women's empowerment. Even if we create safety for a small period of time for the individual, but we don't address the trauma and the abuse and the fear that comes with having been a survivor, even if you create a new environment for that person, a new outside world, it has its own challenges as well. And so we went on a journey to also support the mental health, trauma healing of the women and girls that we support in our work. And this is something that has cut across our institution, which we can dive deeper into in our discussion, not just for women and girls, but also for the men and youth that are leaving armed groups, even for frontline workers, the concept of mental health. For the report and the statistics I shared with you of 1/3 of a population being afflicted by some sort of mental health disorder, that is staggering, and that has implications. And so we started to employ traditional psychosocial support for women and girls, and we were constantly hitting a roadblock. It's uncultural for my community to speak about trauma. It's considered weak or even ungrateful. Even in your most vulnerable and destitute of situations, to sit in front of someone and to speak about the trauma you should feel so lucky to have overcome. But we recognize the importance and the transformational impact of having a support system, of having mental health access. And so we've constantly looked at how to apply measures and tools that could support that journey. And we began to offer sports as an outlet, as a physical medium to engage women and girls. And we applied across our different work as well too. But for this workshop, I want to discuss with you how this introduction of sports started off as a mental health activity, as an outlet to get girls and to get women to express and to create communal bonding and create an entry point for conversation after physical activity, which there's a lot of evidence around as well too. In fact, it's an evidence on the implications of physical activity on sports is for just 1 hour a week in a safe space and a caring coach, it is said to improve the mental health of a person. And that was an activity we felt was very simple for us to introduce. So we began with introducing basketball to women and girls in 2012. And at that time, we didn't have a facility that we had our own basketball court in. It was a very challenging environment, and only a few districts in Mogadishu were accessible. The rest still controlled by Al-Shabaab. So I remember we actually were transporting girls that wanted to play in a small bus with armed escorts just to be able to go play and guard them while they did, and then brought them back to the rest of the spaces that we had, which is completely different with the scenario reality of basketball and sports for women and girls is today. But every time we did so, with the risks that were associated to it, we saw that there was an improvement in energy, self-esteem, and in happiness. And all of these are important indicators and metrics we were actually interested in supporting, not looking into the cognitive and somatic symptoms of trauma only, but also the well-being indicators of the individual as they are on this journey of recovery. And so what started off as just an activity for women and girls to engage in, we also saw that the well-being indicators for the survivors create an opportunity for them to participate more meaningfully and more engaged in the other activities of education. They were able to participate a bit more in activities related to outreach, speaking to their experiences, and they began to join workshops, and that created the basis for how mental health and sports empowered women and girls in our community and invited them to use some of those skills into also leadership positions. And so the question we began to ask ourselves is, can sports be a vehicle, not just for the mental health recovery of survivors that have overcome some of the most heinous violence imaginable, but can this be a medium and a tool that also gives them back their agency to become political advocates for their own communities? And as we saw that it did create traction for them, we began to introduce a curriculum that supported that, not only for women, but also we started to apply that for boys as well too, which I'll get to. And so the impact that we began to see that grew quite organically led to girls finding their voice, wanting to participate in more formal education opportunities, wanting to join youth organizations outside of our ecosystem as well, and to speak to some of the challenging realities they've overcome. We began to introduce sports then for boys as well too, and looking at how sports was a medium where boys were always interested in. It was useful for their rehabilitation through their own victimized lived realities that they've overcome. But it was also an opportunity to introduce a curriculum that we adopted with one of our partners called Coaching Boys to Men. And through a medium of sport of something they already enjoyed, football for them, we were able to introduce what allyship looks like, what being, again, in a very patriarchal society, what being a real man means, of being able to be one that is self-confident, one that is recognizing of someone else's lived reality, and to create some of those skills of both compassion, but also support for a community that you do not belong with, and making sure that they were active contributors to that within our community. And that was an interesting approach that we applied as well too. in recent years, the sports work that we've been doing in Somalia that started off as just an outlet for our community began to professionalize as the environment became a bit more enabling. We saw that girls that had been part of it found their own voice in the space and saw a pipeline of a new positive identity for themselves and wanted to pursue it more actively and consistently. And we created facilities to be able to create that opportunity for them. We know that sports is demonized in our society and politicized to the point that the more public girls were in sports, the more outrage it created in sectors that otherwise had no business policing women and girls' bodies. We saw fatwas by religious scholars being passed on girls playing sports in Somalia. The same religious institutions that would not say anything about hundreds of people being killed in the name of religion. We saw, again, government actors creating facilities for boys to play, recognizing the transformational impact of sports in the community and peace building, but would not allow the same girls to access the sport as well too, because of the conflict between sports and culture. We even saw extremist groups like Al-Shabaab making public statements again around girls not being a part of sports. Yet all the years of creating an opportunity for girls to be a part of it, there was a resistance and a movement growing as well of girls wanting to play. And as an organization who does not want to contribute to creating more harm, we created facilities in safe spaces within our compounds for girls to play. And even with that, we were able to communicate girls' access to sport with a global community, with the Somali diaspora, and create opportunities for girls to play outside of Somalia. We had NBA teams come and support the girls, partnerships and brand endorsements for the players, and really creating an opportunity where girls can reach their potential, even if they never have left Somalia. And again, this contributed to their own well-being and who they are within their community and the opportunities they can pursue. And we have been seeing many of those girls now becoming figures within their community, becoming empowered in ways that are positioning them to be a part of the change of their community. And so the question that we've been asking ourselves is, if we see the undeniable impact of sports in not just offering mental health outlets for girls and women in Somalia, we see that it's also creating an opportunity for agency and leadership and participation in the processes that ensure their own well-being. And there's a global shift now in narratives around shifting from poor and powerless to new positive imagery of girls coming from places like Somalia and from the global South at large. But a lot of the resistance that we're facing now still is from communities perceived understanding of what is acceptable in a place like Somalia. If the community and the girls themselves are benefiting from it and want to participate in it, what then is the discourse of communities like mine, the diaspora, or other actors that think that this is not something girls really want, but it's something that they are being pushed in the name of feminism, empowerment, and those biases of a community that you are not involved with every single day are limiting to gender equality. So these are some of the topics that we're grappling with right now. If we see impact of sports for development for girls in the community, but a cacophony of voices believe that this is a Western implant, that these girls don't actually want to participate. And real empowerment of women and girls in these communities has to be a bit more traditional to their cultures. What does that mean for gender equality and our own biases around that? And this is something I'd love to discuss with you all, because we have been exploring communications, the ethics around it, checking our own biases and how this affects gender equality in different communities around the world. So in Somalia, I could speak for hours on the different strategies that we've applied, whether it's from yoga, surf therapy, whether it's art therapy, safe spaces that we've been able to create. And the impact that we're seeing is not only supporting survivors, but also girls that are evolving in otherwise enabling and challenging environment every day. And these tools have been useful, as we've seen, in their growth in these challenging environments. So I'll wrap it there for now. And very much, I'm keen to pick the brains of everyone in this community on where then is the line between introducing something that you know, that you see creating impact for a community, but then also taking a step back and how that is perceived by others and the limitations of their own perceptions on a community that is resonating and benefiting from it.